The Mediterranean Sea, November 25, 1941, 4:25 p.m. A calm afternoon. Clear skies. 3 British battleships steaming westward in formation, screened by 8 destroyers. Among them, HMS Barham, a veteran of 2 world wars, her 31,000 tons cutting smoothly through azure waters. In exactly 4 minutes, she will be gone. In those 4 minutes, 862 men will die. This is one of World War II's most dramatic naval disasters, a catastrophe so swift, so complete, that it defied comprehension. A disaster captured on film, yet kept secret from the British public for months. The story of men who faced death with no warning, no time to prepare, no chance to escape. This is the story of HMS Barham's last 4 minutes. Built in 1913 at John Brown and Company's shipyards in Clydebank, Scotland, HMS Barham was revolutionary from the moment her keel was laid. One of 5 Queen Elizabeth-class battleships that would transform naval warfare forever. The brainchild of Admiral Jackie Fisher and naval architect Sir Eustace Tennyson d'Eyncourt, these ships represented a quantum leap in warship design. Consider what made them revolutionary: 8 15-inch guns, the most powerful ever mounted on a British warship at that time. Each gun could hurl a shell weighing nearly 1 ton over distances exceeding 20 miles. The roar of a single salvo could be heard for miles, the shells screaming through the air at supersonic speeds, capable of penetrating the thickest armor of any ship afloat. Her armor protection was formidable, 13 inches of hardened steel on the main belt, designed to deflect or stop shells from enemy battleships. Her turrets were armored castles unto themselves, protecting the gun crews inside from everything except direct hits from the largest caliber weapons. At over 600 feet long, longer than 2 football fields placed end to end, she displaced 31,000 tons when fully loaded. Yet despite this massive size and weight, HMS Barham could reach speeds of 24 knots. Faster than any battleship that had come before. This combination of firepower, protection, and speed made the Queen Elizabeth class the most powerful warships in the world when they entered service. She was christened with champagne and ceremony in October 1915, named after Admiral Charles Middleton, 1st Baron Barham, the man who had reorganized the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars over a century before. The name carried weight, history, expectation. HMS Barham became home to over 1,000 men, eventually 1,184 in her wartime complement. These were sailors, officers, engineers, gunners, cooks, medical orderlies, and Royal Marines. They came from every corner of Britain and the Commonwealth. From the shipyards of Glasgow to the fishing villages of Cornwall. From the coal mines of Wales to the sheep stations of Australia. From the streets of London to the farms of New Zealand. Each man knew his station, his duty, his role in the intricate ballet of operating a warship. The engine room crews who kept the massive turbines spinning. The boiler room stokers who fed coal, and later oil, to generate the steam that drove those turbines. The electrical artificers who maintained the complex systems that powered everything from the main guns to the simple light bulbs. The gunners who loaded, aimed, and fired the weapons. The damage control parties who stood ready to contain flooding, fight fires, and repair battle damage. Her baptism of fire came swiftly and brutally. May 31, 1916, the Battle of Jutland, the largest naval battle of World War I, perhaps the largest naval battle in history in terms of sheer tonnage of warships engaged. 2 massive fleets, British and German, colliding in the cold waters off the coast of Denmark. HMS Barham steamed into this battle as part of the 5th Battle Squadron under Rear Admiral Hugh Evan Thomas. The British and German fleets had been maneuvering for position, trying to gain the advantage, when they suddenly found themselves in gun range of each other. What followed was chaos incarnate. Shells, some weighing over a ton, screamed through the air at velocities that created their own thunder. Water spouts erupted around the ships like sudden geysers, each one marking a near miss that could have been fatal. The concussion from near misses alone could buckle plates and kill men through the sheer shock transmitted through the hull. The guns thundered continuously, the blast from each salvo strong enough to knock a man off his feet if he wasn't braced for it. HMS Barham took 5 direct hits from German shells during the engagement. The Mediterranean Sea in World War II became one of the most contested bodies of water on Earth. It wasn't merely a theater of war, it was the strategic heart of the entire conflict between the Allies and the Axis powers in Europe and North Africa. Control of the Mediterranean meant everything to Britain. It meant control of the Suez Canal, the vital waterway that connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and beyond to the Indian Ocean. Through the Suez Canal flowed the lifeline to India, the crown jewel of the British Empire. Through it came oil from the Persian Gulf, troops and supplies from Australia and New Zealand, resources from East Africa and Asia. Lose the Mediterranean, and Britain would be forced to route all shipping around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, adding thousands of miles and weeks of travel time to every voyage. Lose the Mediterranean, and the entire Middle East would be vulnerable to Axis conquest. Lose the Mediterranean, and the war might well be lost. But by 1940 and into 1941, the Mediterranean had become a death trap for British ships. To the north lay fascist Italy under Mussolini, with its powerful Regia Marina, the Italian Royal Navy, boasting modern battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Italian air bases dotted the northern Mediterranean coast from Genoa to Libya, their aircraft capable of reaching any point in the central Mediterranean. The Italian island of Sicily sat astride the central Mediterranean like a massive unsinkable aircraft carrier, its airfields threatening any ship that tried to pass through the narrow waters between Sicily and North Africa. To the south lay North Africa, where British and Commonwealth forces were locked in a seesaw struggle with Italian forces, soon to be reinforced by German troops under the brilliant and aggressive General Erwin Rommel. Control of the North African coast meant control of the southern Mediterranean, control of the approaches to the Suez Canal. To the east lay the Suez Canal itself and the vital oil fields of the Middle East. To the west lay Gibraltar, Britain's fortress guarding the narrow strait that connected the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean, the only way in or out for British ships. And throughout these waters prowled Italian submarines, growing numbers of German U-boats slipping through the Strait of Gibraltar under cover of darkness, and the aircraft of the Regia Aeronautica, turning the Mediterranean into a shooting gallery where any ship could be attacked at any moment. Into this crucible sailed HMS Barham in 1940, now over 25 years old but still formidable, still capable, still carrying over 1,000 men who would serve aboard her through the trials to come. She was assigned to the Mediterranean Fleet, based at Alexandria, Egypt, under the command of Admiral Andrew Cunningham, one of the Royal Navy's most aggressive and capable flag officers. Naval warfare was changing in ways that not everyone fully understood or appreciated. The aircraft carrier was emerging as a potentially decisive weapon. The submarine was proving far more dangerous than most pre-war theorists had predicted. But the battleship, for centuries the ultimate expression of naval power, the ship that decided the outcome of fleet actions, the vessel that nations built, a battleship is not merely a weapon of war. It is a floating city. A self-contained world where over 1,000 men live, work, eat, sleep, and fight in conditions that most civilians would find inconceivable. Aboard HMS Barham in November 1941, the ship's complement had grown to 1,184 officers and men, an increase from peacetime manning levels as additional anti-aircraft gun crews, damage control specialists, and other personnel were added to meet wartime requirements. At the apex of this pyramid of men stood Captain Geoffrey Cook, age 53, a career Royal Navy officer with decades of experience. Cook had risen through the ranks through a combination of professional competence, steady leadership, and the methodical advancement that characterized the peacetime Navy. He had commanded smaller ships, destroyers and cruisers, before being given command of HMS Barham. Command of a battleship in wartime was a crushing responsibility that few could truly understand unless they had experienced it. Every decision Captain Cook made affected the safety of his ship and the lives of 1,184 men. The wrong course could take the ship into danger. The wrong speed could mean arriving too late to support friendly forces or being caught by enemy forces. The wrong tactical decision in combat could result in disaster. Yet a captain couldn't micromanage everything. He had to trust his officers and men to do their jobs without constant supervision. He had to balance aggressive action with prudent caution, offensive capability with defensive necessity. He had to maintain strict discipline while preserving morale. He had to be everywhere and see everything, yet remain calm and steady no matter how chaotic the situation became. Below Captain Cook in the chain of command were dozens of officers, each responsible for specific aspects of the ship's operation. The executive officer, known as Number 1, was the captain's right hand, responsible for the day-to-day running of the ship, for discipline, for ensuring that orders were carried out efficiently. The gunnery officer commanded the main armament, those 8 massive 15-inch guns, plus the secondary battery of smaller guns and the ever-growing array of anti-aircraft weapons. Hundreds of men fell under his command: turret crews, ammunition handlers, fire control specialists, rangefinders, and spotters. The engineer officer commanded the engine rooms and boiler rooms deep in the bowels of the ship, where massive steam turbines drove the propeller shafts, where boilers generated the steam to drive those turbines, where pumps, generators, and countless other pieces of machinery kept the ship operational. His domain was one of heat, noise, and danger, where a burst steam pipe could kill a man in seconds, where a fire could spread rapidly through oil-soaked machinery spaces. The navigator plotted courses, calculated positions, ensured that the ship knew where it was and where it was going. In an era before GPS, before satellite navigation, this required constant celestial observations with sextant and chronometer, dead reckoning calculations, and careful attention to currents, tides, and winds. Then there were the department heads, the division officers, the warrant officers, and the petty officers, the backbone of any navy, the men who knew every inch of the ship, who could diagnose problems by sound or smell alone, who could organize and direct the younger sailors with a mixture of professional authority and practical mentorship. And finally there were the ordinary sailors, the able seamen, the leading seamen, the stokers, the electrical artificers, the shipwrights, the cooks, the medical orderlies, the Royal Marines. These were the men who actually operated the ship's systems, who loaded the guns, who maintained the machinery, who stood watch in all weathers, who performed the thousands of tasks necessary to keep a battleship operational. Life aboard HMS Barham was governed by strict routine and rigid discipline. The ship operated on a watch system, 4 hours on. The gunnery. Hours off duty, around the clock, 7 days a week. Men learned to sleep in brief snatches, to eat when they could, to perform their duties regardless of fatigue or discomfort. Most of the crew slept in hammocks slung in crowded mess decks, spaces that during the day served as dining areas and recreation spaces but at night were transformed into sleeping quarters. Each man had about 18 inches of width for his hammock, slung close to his shipmates. Privacy was non-existent. The air was often stifling, especially in the Mediterranean heat, heavy with the smell of hundreds of men living in close quarters. Personal possessions were limited to what could fit in a small locker, a few changes of clothing, letters from home, perhaps a photograph or two of family. Everything else was communal: the sleeping spaces, the mess tables, the toilets, called heads in naval parlance, the washing facilities. The food was plain, often monotonous. Corned beef, hardtack biscuits, tinned vegetables, puddings heavy with suet, tea strong enough to strip paint. Fresh food was a luxury, quickly consumed in the days after leaving port. Drinking water was often warm and had a metallic taste from the tanks it was stored in. Fresh water for while HMS Barham's crew went about their duties in the bright Mediterranean sun, death was approaching from below. U-331 was a Type WWII U-boat, the workhorse of Germany's submarine fleet, the weapon that was strangling Britain's maritime lifelines in the Atlantic and increasingly threatening operations in the Mediterranean. She was 220 feet long, small compared to surface warships, but large for a submarine of her era. She displaced 770 tons on the surface, somewhat less when submerged. And she carried a crew of 44 men packed into a space so confined that it defied description. Life aboard a U-boat was claustrophobic beyond anything most people could imagine. The pressure hull, the inner hull that maintained integrity at depth, was crammed with equipment. Machinery, supplies, weapons, and men. Torpedo tubes occupied the bow and stern. Torpedoes not loaded in the tubes were stored throughout the boat wherever space could be found, under the deck plates, suspended from overhead, anywhere. The conning tower contained the periscopes, the attack instruments, the radio equipment. The control room housed the diving plane's controls, the depth gauges, the trim tanks controls. The diesel engines that propelled the boat on the surface were massive, deafening pieces of machinery. The electric motors used for underwater propulsion were somewhat quieter but still took up enormous space. The batteries that powered those electric motors filled compartments below the deck plates, giving off hydrogen gas that could explode if not properly vented, giving off chlorine gas if seawater reached them, chlorine that could kill every man aboard. Fresh water was severely rationed. There was no water for bathing, for washing clothes, for any but the most essential purposes. Men went weeks or even months without a proper bath. They grew beards because shaving consumed precious water. Their clothes became stiff with salt, sweat, and diesel oil. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, of unwashed bodies, of cooking food, of the chemical stench of the batteries, of human waste from the cramped toilet facilities. Space was so limited that many men had to share bunks in rotation, hot bunking, it was called, where one man's shift ended and he climbed into a bunk that another man had just vacated, the sheet still warm with the previous occupant's body heat. Some men slept on top of torpedoes, on makeshift bunks rigged wherever a few feet of space could be found. Yet despite these appalling conditions, U-boats were devastatingly effective weapons. They could strike from beneath the waves without warning. They could attack and disappear before defenders could react. They were patient hunters, capable of waiting for days for the perfect opportunity. And when that opportunity came, they were deadly. U-331's commander, Kapitänleutnant Hans Dietrich von Tiesenhausen, was 25 years old, younger than many of the sailors he commanded, but thoroughly trained in the demanding school of submarine warfare. Von Tiesenhausen had joined the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, in 1934 at age 18. He had attended the Naval Academy at Flensburg-Merwick, had volunteered for U-boat service in 1940, and had taken command of U-331 in March 1941. In the claustrophobic world of a U-boat, the commander's personality set the tone for the entire crew. A panicky commander created a panicky crew, and a panicky crew made fatal mistakes. A reckless commander got everyone killed through unnecessary risks. Von Tiesenhausen was neither panicky nor reckless. He was intelligent, methodical, patient, willing to wait hours or even days for the perfect shot rather than rushing into a hasty attack that would likely fail and might get his boat sunk. By November 1941, U-331 had already achieved some success in the Mediterranean. She had damaged the British destroyer HMS Barham in early November, though Barham had been salvaged and would eventually return to service. She had sunk the British transport ship Glenfinlas. Von Tiesenhausen and his crew were experienced, confident in their abilities, and hunting for bigger prey. The strategic situation in the Mediterranean favored the U-boats in many ways. The Mediterranean was narrower than the Atlantic Ocean, which meant that shipping had to follow more predictable routes, there was less room to maneuver, less space to evade. The water was generally calmer than the storm-tossed Atlantic, making periscope observations easier. The water was clearer, making visual attacks more feasible. And British anti-submarine measures, while improving constantly, were still far from perfect. Sonar, the underwater sound detection system the British called ASTIC, was primitive by modern standards, effective only at relatively short ranges, easily confused by water conditions, temperature layers, and the noise of the hunting ship's own propellers. Depth charges had to be dropped almost directly over a submarine to have much chance of damaging it. And there were never enough escort ships to protect all the convoys, all the naval formations, all the ships at sea. Moreover, the German U-boats had access to excellent intelligence. Axis reconnaissance aircraft, Italian planes and German planes based in Greece, Crete, and North Africa, regularly spotted British ships and radioed their positions, courses, and speeds. The German B-Dienst, the radio intelligence service, had broken some British naval codes and could sometimes read British communications. U-boat commanders knew prepare tubes 1 through 4 for firing, he ordered quietly. Throughout the boat, men moved to action stations as silently as possible. In the forward torpedo room, final checks were made on the 4 torpedoes loaded in the bow tubes. The outer tube doors, the doors that opened to the sea, were opened carefully, slowly, to avoid making noise that British hydrophones might detect. U-331 began to move forward, gliding through the water at just 4 knots, barely making a ripple on the surface. Von Tiesenhausen kept the periscope raised now, tracking the approaching battleships, calculating the constantly changing geometry of the attack. This was the most dangerous moment. The submarine was committed now. Moving toward the enemy formation. If spotted, U-331 would be hunted down and destroyed. Von Tiesenhausen knew that dozens of U-boats had been lost in the Mediterranean already, sent to the bottom by depth charges from British destroyers and escort vessels. He knew that the Mediterranean floor was littered with the wrecks of submarines and the bodies of men who had taken the same kinds of risks he was taking now. But he also knew his duty. He also knew the target. And he also knew that opportunities like this were rare. Through the periscope, HMS Barham grew larger and larger in his view. He could see details now, her superstructure, her main gun turrets, the figures of men moving on her decks, completely unaware that death was approaching from below. She was majestic, powerful, the product of decades of naval engineering and tradition. And she was vulnerable. Von Tiesenhausen calculated the deflection angle, the lead he needed to give his torpedoes to account for Barham's speed and course. The torpedoes would travel at 30 knots once fired, but they took time to reach their target. In that time, the target would have moved. He had to aim not at where Barham was, but at where she would be when the torpedoes arrived. The range was closing. 1,000 yards. 900. 800. His hand was on the firing mechanism. His eye never left the periscope. Everything depended on timing, on judgment, on experience. 750 yards. The shot was as perfect as it would ever be. Von Tiesenhausen took a deep breath, steadied himself, and gave the order that would change everything. Los. Fire. 4 torpedoes leaped from U-331's bow tubes, compressed air propelling them out of the tubes and into the sea. Their electric motors engaged immediately, driving them forward at 30 knots toward HMS Barham. Unlike the older torpedoes powered by internal combustion engines, these electric torpedoes left almost no wake, no trail of bubbles to give away their position. They were nearly invisible, nearly silent. They were also nearly unavoidable. 16:25 hours and 50 seconds. 4:25 p.m. and 50 seconds. The first torpedo struck HMS Barham on her port side, below the armor belt that protected her from gunfire, in one of the most vulnerable areas of the ship. The explosion was massive beyond description. A column of white water erupted alongside the ship, shooting 100 feet into the air, gleaming in the afternoon sun. The shock wave from the explosion rippled through Barham's hull. Like an earthquake, buckling steel plates, rupturing bulkheads, shattering equipment, throwing men off their feet throughout the ship. 3 seconds later, the second torpedo hit, slightly aft of the first. Another massive explosion. Another column of water. More devastating damage. Then the third torpedo struck. 3 catastrophic explosions in rapid succession, each one blowing a hole in Barham's side large enough to drive a truck through, each one allowing thousands of tons of seawater to pour into the ship's interior. The fourth torpedo missed, its aim just slightly off, running beneath the ship's keel and continuing harmlessly into the empty sea beyond. But 3 torpedoes were more than enough. Far more than enough. On HMS Barham's bridge, Captain Geoffrey Cook felt the ship shudder beneath him. The force of the explosions was transmitted through the entire structure of the ship, vibrating every plate, every beam, every rivet. Men were thrown off their feet, hurled against bulkheads and equipment. The sound was deafening, not just the explosions themselves, but the rending shriek of tearing metal, the roar of water flooding into the hull, the beginning of dozens of different alarms wailing throughout the ship. Damage reports began flooding in immediately, but they were fragmentary, confused, often contradictory. The internal communication systems had been damaged by the explosions. Some phone lines were dead. Some speaking tubes were crushed. Messages had to be passed by runners, men racing through the ship carrying verbal reports, and those reports were often incomplete or out of date by the time they reached the bridge. But Captain Cook didn't need detailed damage reports to know that his ship was in mortal danger. He could feel it. The ship was already listing to port, the side where the torpedoes had struck, and the list was increasing with frightening speed. 5 degrees. Then 10 degrees. Then 15 degrees. Water was pouring into the hull through 3 enormous breaches. Thousands of tons per minute. The pumps activated automatically, driven by men in the damage control parties who were already racing toward the flooding compartments. But the pumps were designed to handle flooding from 1 or maybe 2 damaged compartments, not the catastrophic, overwhelming influx of seawater now flooding into HMS Barham. In the engine rooms and boiler rooms deep in the bowels of the ship, men worked frantically to keep the machinery running, to keep the ship under power for as long as possible. But the conditions were becoming hellish. The lights flickered as electrical systems failed. Steam pipes ruptured, filling compartments with scalding, invisible vapor that could strip flesh from bone in seconds. Men screamed in pain and terror as the ship died around them. The list continued to increase. 20 degrees now. Loose equipment began to slide across decks, crashing into bulkheads. Walking became difficult. Running was nearly impossible. Men clung to handrails, to each other, trying to maintain their footing as the deck tilted beneath them. Captain Cook realized, almost immediately, that there was no saving his ship. No ship could survive 3 torpedo hits in such a short span of time, in such a concentrated area. The damage was too extensive. The flooding was too rapid. HMS Barham was doomed. But he still had 1,184 men aboard who needed orders, who needed leadership, who needed a chance to survive. He gave the order that every captain dreads having to give, the order that ends a ship's life. All hands abandon ship. Abandon ship. The order was passed throughout HMS Barham by every means available. Officers and petty officers shouted it. Messengers ran through the ship relaying it. Boatswain's mates piped it on their whistles. Some men heard it through the few communication systems still working. Others saw men abandoning their stations and knew what was happening without being told. Throughout the ship, men began moving toward the upper decks, toward the life rafts and boats, toward the only chance they had of surviving. But there was so little time. So terribly little time. The list continued to increase relentlessly. 25 degrees. 30 degrees. Walking was now impossible without holding onto something. The ladders that men had to climb to reach the upper decks were now at steep angles, requiring hand-over-hand climbing. Equipment, supplies, anything not secured crashed across compartments, injuring men, blocking passages. For the men in the lower compartments, the engine rooms, the boiler rooms, the magazines, the shell rooms, the journey to the upper decks was a nightmare. They had to climb ladders that were now nearly vertical. They had to force open hatches against the weight of water above them. They had to navigate through passages where water was already knee-deep and rising rapidly, where the lights had failed, where the way forward was unclear. Some didn't make it. Trapped by the flooding, by jammed hatches that wouldn't open, by failing lights leaving them in total darkness, by injuries that prevented them from climbing, they died in the steel belly of their ship. They drowned in darkness, in spaces that became their tombs, their final moments ones of terror and desperation. On the upper decks, the organized evacuation that had been drilled into the crew broke down into controlled chaos. Life rafts were launched, men working together to get them over the side and into the water. But many men didn't wait for life rafts. They simply jumped, preferring to take their chances in the sea rather than stay aboard a ship that was clearly sinking. The jump itself was terrifying. HMS Barham's upper deck was now perhaps 40 or 50 feet above the water level due to the list. Men had to climb over the tilted deck, over the side, and jump out into empty air, hoping they cleared the ship's side, hoping they didn't hit debris or equipment on the way down, hoping the impact with the water didn't injure them. They hit the water hard, some feet first, some in belly flops that knocked the wind out of them. The Mediterranean in November was relatively warm compared to the North Atlantic, perhaps 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, but it was still cold enough to be a shock to the system. Men surfaced, gasping, disoriented, and began swimming away from the ship as fast as they could. They swam because they knew that when Barham finally went down, the suction of the sinking ship could drag them under with her. They had to get clear. Had to put distance between themselves and the dying battleship. Oil was leaking from ruptured fuel tanks, spreading across the water's surface in an iridescent slick. Men swimming through it found it coating their bodies, their faces, getting into their mouths and noses, making breathing difficult, making swimming exhausting. The oil was thick, viscous, clinging. Some men choked on it, vomiting it up, struggling to breathe. The escorting destroyers were racing toward HMS Barham now, their crews preparing to pick up survivors. But the destroyer captains faced a terrible dilemma. They knew that U-331 was still out there somewhere, still a threat. A destroyer stopped in the water to pick up survivors was vulnerable to torpedo attack itself. The submarine that had killed Barham could easily attack the rescue ships. But they also knew that men were dying in the water. That every minute of delay meant more men succumbing to exhaustion, to hypothermia, to drowning. The destroyer captains made their decisions. They would attempt rescue, but they would remain underway, moving slowly through the survivors, pulling men aboard while still maintaining enough speed to maneuver if attacked. Aboard HMS Valiant, one of the other battleships in the formation, a cameraman was filming. He had been filming the fleet in formation, routine footage of ships at sea. And now, almost by accident, he was capturing one of the most dramatic moments in naval warfare. His camera caught HMS Barham as she continued her death roll. The footage shows the massive ship tilting further and further to port, her starboard side rising out of the water, exposing the red anti-fouling paint on her bottom, the massive bronze propellers that would never turn again, the rudders that would never steer again. Men can be seen on the tilted hull, tiny figures against the vast expanse of steel, some jumping, some sliding down into the water, some simply standing there, transfixed, unable to move, perhaps accepting their fate. The list reached 40 degrees. 50 degrees. HMS Barham was rolling completely onto her side now, her port side completely submerged, her starboard side now nearly horizontal. Men continued to pour off the ship, hundreds of them, more and more every second. Some were calm, having accepted what was happening. Others were panicked, screaming, flailing. Officers and petty officers tried to maintain some semblance of order, tried to ensure that as many men as possible escaped, but it was chaos now, pure survival instinct taking over. Captain Geoffrey Cook was last seen on the bridge, standing calmly, giving orders, ensuring that his men had the best chance possible to escape. He made no attempt to save himself. Naval tradition dictated that a captain went down with his ship, and Cook was a man of tradition, of duty. He would remain at his post to the end. Able seaman William Hopkins, the 19-year-old from Devon, was on the upper deck when the evacuation order came. He helped several men climb up from below, forming a human chain to pull injured or exhausted men up through the tilted hatches. When someone shouted that everyone who could get out had gotten out, Hopkins climbed over the side and jumped, hitting the water hard, going deep under, kicking desperately to reach the surface, breaking through into air and beginning to swim away as fast as his arms and legs could carry him. Petty Officer James Mitchell and his damage control party had been trying to contain the flooding when they realized it was hopeless. Mitchell ordered his men to evacuate and led them up through the increasingly tilted ship, through passages that were becoming nightmares of twisted metal and rising water. They reached the upper deck just in time, climbed over the side, and dropped into the sea. All of them made it. Some of Mitchell's party didn't. Marine Donald Wood was at his anti-aircraft gun station when the ship was hit. He felt the explosions, saw the ship immediately begin to list, and knew what it meant. When the order to abandon ship came, he helped launch a life raft, then jumped into the water near it. He would spend the next several minutes helping other men reach the raft, pulling exhausted swimmers to safety. Midshipman Peter Maitland was on the bridge with Captain Cook when the torpedoes struck. He heard the captain give the abandoned ship order, then made his way down from the bridge and over the side. He followed his training, swam clear of the ship, and waited in the water to be rescued, watching his ship die. And HMS Barham was dying. The list had reached 60 degrees. 70 degrees. She was almost completely on her side now. Her port side was deep underwater. Her starboard side was exposed to the air, her hull plates gleaming in the afternoon sun. Men stood on the hull itself, balanced on the red-painted steel, hundreds of them, those who had waited too long or couldn't bring themselves to jump earlier. Now they had no choice. As the ship continued to roll, they slid down the hull into the water, some maintaining control, others tumbling helplessly. 16:29 hours. 4:29 p.m. 4 minutes since the first torpedo struck. HMS Barham rolled completely onto her side, her starboard hull now horizontal, parallel to the water surface. For a brief moment, she seemed to pause, as if gathering herself for one final effort. And then, the magazine exploded. 15-inch shells stored in HMS Barham's forward magazines, dozens of them, each weighing nearly 1 ton, each filled with high explosive, detonated in a catastrophic chain reaction. The explosion was apocalyptic. A fireball erupted from the ship, a ball of orange and red flame hundreds of feet across, expanding upward and outward with unimaginable force. The column of fire shot into the sky, climbing 300, 400, 500 feet into the air, a pillar of destruction visible for miles. The shock wave rippled across the water, a physical force that could be felt miles away. Men in the water felt it as a hammer blow, as if a giant hand had struck them. Some were killed instantly by the pressure wave. Others were stunned, their internal organs damaged by the sudden compression. The sound was heard 20 miles away. Ships that far distant felt their hulls vibrate from the concussion. It was a deep, bass boom that seemed to come from the earth itself, a sound that men would remember for the rest of their lives. Debris rained from the sky. Pieces of the ship, steel plates, equipment, fittings, anything that had been blown into the air by the explosion, came tumbling back down. Some pieces were small. Others were massive chunks of metal weighing tons. They fell into the water with enormous splashes, creating hazards for the men swimming there. And mixed with the debris were bodies and parts of bodies of men who had been on or near the ship when the magazine exploded. Men who had been killed instantly by the blast, their bodies hurled hundreds of feet into the air. The water churned and boiled from the heat of the explosion, from the force of the blast, from the debris falling into it. Oil on the surface ignited in places, creating patches of fire that men had to swim away from or be burned. When the smoke began to clear seconds later, HMS Barham was gone. Completely, utterly gone. Where moments before a 31,000-ton battleship had been, 643 feet long, displacing as much as several hundred houses, home to over 1,000 men, a weapon capable of hurling shells over 20 miles, there was now only water. Debris floated on the surface, pieces of wood, life rafts, equipment, oil, and the bodies of men. But the ship herself had disappeared, broken into pieces by the magazine explosion, those pieces now sinking rapidly toward the Mediterranean floor 6,000 feet below. From first torpedo strike to final magazine explosion, exactly 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, HMS Barham had gone from a fully operational warship to complete destruction. In those 4 minutes, 862 men had died or received injuries from which they would die. But 450 men survived, pulled from the water over the next several hours by the escorting destroyers and other ships that arrived to help with the rescue. William Hopkins survived. The explosion threw him through the air, but somehow he avoided serious injury. He was picked up by HMS Hotspur, one of the destroyers, was taken to Alexandria, and would eventually recover to fight again. James Mitchell survived. He was in the water when the explosion occurred, far enough away to escape the worst of the blast. He was hauled aboard a destroyer, exhausted, coated in oil, but alive. Donald Wood survived by clinging to his life raft and then to a piece of wreckage, spending over 3 hours in the water before being spotted and rescued. Peter Maitland survived, following his training, remaining calm, and being picked up by a destroyer's boat. But Captain Geoffrey Cook did not survive. He was last seen on the bridge of his ship, going down with her as was his duty. His body was never recovered. 861 other men died with him. Fathers and sons. Husbands and brothers. Friends and shipmates. Each one an individual with a life, with people who loved him, with dreams and hopes for the future. All gone in 4 minutes. Deep below the surface, U-331 slipped away into the depths, evading the British destroyers that were now searching frantically for her. Von Tiesenhausen took his boat deep and silent, ordered ultra-quiet routine, no talking, minimal movement, all non-essential equipment shut down. He could hear the sounds of ships passing overhead, of depth charges exploding in the distance as the destroyers searched, of the chaos his torpedoes had created. But the destroyers didn't find U-331. Von Tiesenhausen had timed his attack perfectly, had positioned his boat in exactly the right place, and now he took her deep enough and kept her quiet enough to escape. Hours later, when darkness had fallen and the British ships had moved away, U-331 surfaced carefully. Von Tiesenhausen raised his radio antenna and transmitted a brief message to German naval headquarters in Rome. One British battleship, Queen Elizabeth class, torpedoed and sunk. Position 32 degrees 34 minutes north, 26 degrees 24 minutes east. Estimate complete loss. U-331. In Germany, when the message was received and decoded, the news was greeted with jubilation. Sinking a British battleship was one of the greatest achievements a U-boat commander could accomplish. Von Tiesenhausen was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military decorations. His crew was celebrated. U-331 was hailed as one of the most successful boats in the Mediterranean. But submarine warfare is a young man's game, and luck in war never lasts forever. U-331 continued operating in the Mediterranean through the winter of 1941-42 and into the autumn of 1942. She conducted more patrols, fired more torpedoes, attacked more ships. But she never again achieved the dramatic success of that November afternoon when she sent HMS Barham to the bottom. On November 17, 1942, almost exactly 1 year after sinking Barham, U-331's luck ran out. The submarine was operating off the coast of Algeria, near the port of Algiers, when she was detected by British aircraft conducting anti-submarine patrols. The aircraft called in surface ships, the destroyer HMS Petard and the minesweeper HMS Aldenham, and together they began hunting U-331 relentlessly. Von Tiesenhausen tried every trick he knew to escape. He changed course frequently, trying to throw off the hunters. He went deep, pushing the boat to the limits of its test depth. He ordered ultra-quiet routine, hoping to avoid detection by sonar. He released oil and debris to simulate a sinking submarine, hoping the British would break off the search. But the British ships were persistent, their sonar operators were skilled, and their depth charges were accurate. Hour after hour, the attack continued. Depth charges exploded around U-331, each one sending shock waves through the boat, each one loosening rivets, cracking welds, causing leaks to spring in the pressure hull. Finally, after hours of punishment, with the boat badly damaged, with air running low, with no hope of escaping submerged, von Tiesenhausen made the agonizing decision that every submarine commander dreaded. He had to surface. Had to abandon ship. had to scuttle his boat to prevent her from being captured. U-331 broke through the surface, water streaming from her hull. Before her crew could even fully emerge from the hatches, British guns opened fire. Von Tiesenhausen ordered everyone out, ordered the demolition charges set, ordered his men to abandon ship immediately. The crew scrambled out of the submarine and jumped into the water. Demolition charges were activated to ensure U-331 would sink. Within minutes, the submarine was settling by the stern, water pouring into her through the open hatches and the seacocks that had been opened. U-331 slid beneath the Mediterranean waves and vanished, taking with her the instruments of her success, sinking to join the hundreds of other wrecks that littered the Mediterranean floor. Of U-331's crew of 44 men, 32 survived and were picked up by the British ships. They became prisoners of war, spending the remainder of the conflict in POW camps in Britain and Canada, far from the war. 11 men died, either killed by British gunfire during the brief surface action or drowned during the abandonment of the boat. Hans Dietrich von Tiesenhausen survived. He spent the rest of the war in captivity, was repatriated to Germany in 1947, and lived until the year 2000, dying at the age of 84. In later years, he rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. When asked about the sinking of HMS Barham, he was reported to have said simply, "It was my duty." Many men died on both sides. "I am not proud of killing, only of having done my duty." It was a sentiment that many veterans of World War II would echo, an acknowledgement of the horror of war, of the terrible necessity of killing in wartime, and of the moral complexity that haunts those who survive. The loss of HMS Barham should have been front-page news across Britain. A battleship. The loss was kept secret for 3 months. As more losses followed, Prince of Wales, Repulse, then Queen Elizabeth and Valiant damaged, the Admiralty feared the news would devastate morale. Survivors were sworn to secrecy. Families of the 862 dead received only telegrams, missing, presumed killed. Their mourning had to be hidden. On January 27, 1942, the Admiralty announced, HMS Barham was sunk by a U-boat on November 25, 1941. The casualty list, 862 names. The film footage wasn't released until after the war. It has since been viewed by millions. The wreck lies 60 miles northwest of Mersa Matruh in 6,000 feet of water, protected as a war grave. Memorials throughout Britain honor the dead. The last survivor, William Hopkins, died in 2015. The lessons remain. War is brutal and unforgiving. HMS Barham, 31,000 tons of steel and armor, was destroyed by 3 torpedoes in 4 minutes. 862 men went to sea expecting to return. Some were teenagers. Others were Great War veterans. Each was an individual with hopes and dreams. Each deserves to be remembered not as a statistic but as a person who lived, who mattered, who was loved. November 25, 1941. A calm afternoon. Then in 4 minutes, everything changed. Today, HMS Barham rests in the deep Mediterranean. But her memory lives on, in memorials, in history, in ceremonies every November 25. They had no time to escape. But they will never be forgotten. 4 minutes. 862 lives. A lesson in blood and steel. This has been the story of HMS Barham. May all who sailed in her rest in peace.